Okay, so the title gives you a clue to the next topic of the panel. We're going to ask the question whether we're ready for large-scale monetization. And to open the panel, I'd like to hand over to Dominique Houde, a partner at Improved Corporate Finance, for some opening words. Dominique, please.
Thank you, Marc. So, hi, everyone. So, first of all, a few words on Improved before we go in our topic. So, I think many of you probably have heard about Improved in some of our transactions. So, we are a boutique, a corporate finance boutique, and we do basically two things. We help entrepreneurs with fundraise, largely Series B and C and D, and we also do M&A. So this is really our two main areas of activity. And we are really focused on energy transition and mobility. So this is probably the difference between us and other technology investment bank. We really try to follow, to focus on that sector, and that kept us very busy in the last few years. In fact, we have completed for about 3.7 billion of transactions that really kept us busy in all the different elements of the value chain in EV charging, all the way from the asset-based solutions, the asset-heavy CPOs, such as a PowerDot, which has a large investment in Antin, but also the various solution providers, the hardware makers. One transaction we advised not long ago in North America was the sale of Rhombus, which was purchased by Borg Warner. We've been present as well in the software as well as energy management and telematics. So in total, about 100 transactions completed. And what is a very international, it's a global market in terms of investors, in terms of players, and 90% of all the transactions are cross-border. A quick summary of where we are in terms of the volume of investment and transaction in the sector. We have had quite a growth really between 2020 and the beginning of 2022 so far, going from about 364 million being invested to more than 2 billion this year. And I think what's really interesting in that in these 2 years only is also where the investment is coming from, and you have an increasing amount coming from institutional investors, which is energy funds, pension funds, others. And that also reflects, I would say, the more accepted the value proposition and the risk proposition as well. And you have still some VCs in certain areas and corporates, but it is really recognizing that e-mobility is here to stay, and the growth as well will be there. One area that has been really interesting for investors and everyone looking at the sector is how charging can be part not only of the issue in terms of having a lot of demand from the grid, but also part of the solution through to smart charging. And in some ways, there have been a lot of operating model emerging and some potential emerging. So you have seen, for instance, like the ability to do control charging when you can set the time of the charging to focus on the more affordable one. You also have bidirectional charging, which is now possible. You've seen as well some vehicle grid integration. A lot of it is on a trial basis, and a kind of on a larger scale, the utility scale flexibility, which is a market in itself. And I think on this page, what you see is that the demand in hardware and software in all these markets has been going up quite considerably. For instance, from 23 million only in 2021 all the way to 2.3 billion that will be up in 2030. So there's clearly going to be demand in terms of the tools to do that. But I think the main question we have, moving to the next page, is are we going to bring scale to that? I think there's been a journey where many of those technologies have started to work in certain quantities. So the question is, can this be a real case, and can the investors who invested in it eventually see the returns? But importantly, is this going to operate at scale for the benefits of the users and for the benefit of the grid as well? So really the question is, where are we on this journey? And this is why we have this panel today. And just to give you an example, for instance, what was indicated to be the potential for savings, for instance, in controlled charging was up to about £600 per year per user. That's mostly for the end user, and you have additional amounts as well for bidirectional charging, and even more when it comes to vehicle grid integration. So what we thought to do today is to bring in the panel some founders and CEOs of companies who have been involved very much in this area. Marc, over to you.
Opportunity indeed. So I'm just going to introduce the other panelists that we see here. We've got Nick Woolley, who's the CEO of EV.Energy, and Stephen Meersman on the end over there, founding director of Zenobe Energy. So I'd like to welcome these gentlemen to the stage. Thank you. Okay, great. Just a reminder before we begin with questions, we will come to audience questions through the panel, and especially at the end. And if anyone is viewing online, then please do enter any questions you've got into the chat, and we'll pick those up. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the questions. Hello, gents. Good afternoon. I'll begin with you, Dominique, if I can. Controlled or managed charging and grid flexibility have reached sort of large-scale commercialization in hardware and software sales, but what other use cases do we see?
Yeah, so I think one of the main use cases you see, maybe one of the easiest to identify with, is I think what you have on a residential basis, for instance, the one we mentioned initially, where as a customer you can have in your home a charger, and by varying through smart charging the element of when you will actually charge, depending on your pricing, you can actually save money as if you were charging on a fixed time every day. And this element, in fact, from an amount of money, there have been quite a few examples of people saving up to £600–700 per year. And I think in terms of does it reach mass a certain scale, if you think about how many electric cars we have, well, we probably have a total of about 1 million on our roads in the UK, which is a split between the BEVs and the hybrids. But I think if you look in the year 2030, for instance, we should have about 7 million EVs. So I think with those 7 million EVs, by saving this amount of money, you will look at a kind of overall saving by the users of about 5 billion, roughly 5 billion pounds, and that's starting to be kind of a reasonable number. So I think the answer is yes, we're going in this direction, but from a point of view of number of vehicles on the road, this is still fairly early on.
Of course. Nick, I'm just going to extend that question to you if I can. Where do you see the most substantial cost savings being realised within the residential sector, and to what extent are they being monetised at this point?
Yeah, so as Dominique mentioned, there are savings for the typical homeowner now installing a charger inside their home. They can save by optimizing for time of use rates against the availability on the grid. We've now had the introduction by National Grid for the demand flexibility service, because we're worried about grid issues happening this winter, and you can save additional money as an individual electric vehicle owner charging your electric vehicle at home. And then the other big use case that we see that's being driven by the energy crisis is there's a lot of people wanting to install other devices inside the home, like solar panels as well. And so charging your electric vehicle using solar panels and avoiding the cost of energy from the grid when the cost of energy on the grid is really, really rising is becoming increasingly important. And I think all of those things together, yeah, mean you can save £600–800. We have users on our platform that are saving, some of the London taxi drivers on our platform saving a couple of £1,000s a year on just optimizing their electric vehicle charging for the right times for the grid, and then also for their local generation too.
And do you think we're starting to see, or we are going to see, a change in who can benefit from a lot of those savings? Thinking particularly, you touched on consumers a little bit there, but there's also, of course, manufacturers and leasing companies and anybody else that might be involved in that. Is that something? Could I come to you for that, and then maybe on to you, Stephen?
Yeah, I do think so. I think ultimately it has to be delivered through the electric vehicle driver. So everybody who drives a car wants their electric vehicle charged for the time that they need it. And Stephen can talk about this in the bus sector. It's very, very important. But we all fundamentally want that. So we have to deliver a value proposition that works for them. But I think increasingly that means that, if you're a fleet operator, if you've got a fleet manager that has a set of fleet drivers underneath, then there is a benefit to enable smart charging services. So you can save money across the entire fleet. if you're a car OEM and you're selling your vehicles and you're maybe leasing them for a number of different years, there's a benefit there in terms of the reduction in the total cost of ownership of those electric vehicles that you can then roll out to your end customers. So I think increasingly those types of parties are going to be looking at things like smart and optimized charging and using it as a way to enhance the value proposition that they're delivering back to their end, to individual drivers.
And is that the way you see things, Stephen?
Yeah, and I think it's sort of it's quite a long decision tree in a way, because if you want to save on your electric vehicle, the best thing you can do is just use less kilowatt hours, right? Drive more energy efficiently, which then has a knock-on effect, because then it gives you more flexibility, because you have more choice over how much you then charge that reduced amount of energy and what time window, so you can participate more in the services that Nick and Dominic were talking about. But I think the other bit is who benefits is always a bit the question, right? Because if somebody's, say, doing lots of vehicle to grid with your battery and eating up your battery warranty and not compensating you for it, you're probably going to have an opinion about that. So how do you pull the benefits and the risks together in a business model where the party that are taking the risk, taking the benefit, and get that alignment of incentives? And that's sort of where we see that parties such as ourselves or such as EV.Energy, you can get all these things together and use it as a service rather than something you constantly have to go through a decision tree yourself as a user every time you plug in, which could be quite cumbersome and time consuming.
It's a complicated landscape already, just from the opening 5 minutes or so. Just a question for you, Dominique, really. When we start to take that into the cost side, and we've touched a little bit on fleet there and sort of larger scale things, where do you think the potential exists for larger scale cost savings? And has there been realization of those cost savings to date?
Yeah, so I think if we're looking at of course, the energy being used, that being saved, I think the solutions that we just explained, as they will scale to all the users, will be significant. But I think the other side of the coin is also, what about the cost of the solutions, the hardware, the software which is used for this? I think when it comes to the hardware, we see quick consolidation in the sector. We see a much higher reliability. So we will have the emergence of I would say, key players in both the DC world and in the AC world as well. So that will reduce the cost, and quite importantly as well, the reliability, and that will in turn have more cost saving. And when it comes to the solution and the software solutions, there's also a consolidation there, but ultimately by deploying those software solutions with many more users, many more B2B users as well, and end users, that will per unit, per transaction, that will bring significant cost savings. So in some way, we're only at the beginning of that cost saving journey.
And I guess there's a question for all three of you, actually. We've sort of hinted at it a couple of times around scale. And when do you think that energy providers or utilities have really, are they just dipping their toe in, or are we seeing anyone really go after it and sort of seize the sort of early opportunity? Nick, would you like to?
Yeah, so I think, right now Dominique said there's like 1 million vehicles on the road. Each of those vehicles is approximately, from a residential perspective, is about 1 kilowatt. So that's about 1 gigawatt of load. In 2030, there could be maybe 10 million vehicles. That's 10 gigawatts. So you can quickly get to a power plant that's going to be bigger than Hinkley Point C with controlling and managing all of this electric vehicle load. Right now, it's at the very innovation stage. There are markets opening up, demand flexibility services coming forward from National Grid. The DNOs are starting to procure services. The energy retailers are starting to do things. It's very much at the kind of innovation and exciting stage of the market. It's not at scale yet, but the opportunity is really vast. But when you get it through to, say, 2030 with 10 million vehicles on the UK's roads, and then globally multiple tens of millions of electric vehicles that you could control for the benefit of integrating more renewable energy into the energy system.
I think the industrial scale of the spectrum has been moving a lot quicker in a sort of invisible way compared to what people expect. And with the utilities, yes, they could focus on agile tariffs and all these other things, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, but if we really want them to accelerate this transition as much as they can, I'd almost want them to focus on another part of the spectrum, which is how do you get these vehicles connected quicker? How do you streamline your connection process so that a bus depot or a truck depot doesn't have to wait 18 months for a connection to even be approved? Or how can councils help on planning permissions and other kinds of things that are sometimes holding these things back? So I'd have a different request for the utility.
And maybe one additional comment here. I think if you look at how the market is scaling and how the savings are scaling, I think what is important to see is that it does not necessarily happen at the same speed for the individual users than on the larger users or at a system basis. Like for instance, what we mentioned earlier is that some drivers today already can save £600-700. That's significant, or even as Nick mentioned, the examples of frequent user with £1,000 or more per year. That's already quite a lot at the scale of the driver. So that has significantly expanded since a few years ago. But however, on a system basis, when you see the benefits of demand response on a measurable scale, really for the utility energy providers, that will take a bit more time. So again, the speed at which a certain scale can be reached varies from some of the different members of the ecosystem.
And have you seen, or do you consider that there is a very, very clear picture and pathway for anyone who's thinking about large-scale monetization? Is it easy for them to see that picture in your experience, or do you think there's a more clear story to be told for investors or for anyone who's planning strategy for the future? What are we seeing that's going well, and where are we seeing people who are a bit nervous?
I can say already for the investors, I think there's already players being positioned, people that are active in the trading area, for instance, that really see ultimately when you have all those batteries of vehicles that are present that can be connected for the grid for demand response. You can already do it on a large scale with fixed batteries. I think we have several companies who have these large batteries next to substations and doing arbitrage all the time. That happens. But I think if you try to bring all the vehicles and their batteries to do the same thing, you have already some energy trading companies associated and investing in that concept. So I think there's a pathway there, which again is in the fairly early days.
Just a question that's coming online, actually, just related to that. We're interested to get some thoughts on it. Can you give us a view on investor appetite and sentiment for transactions and fundraising in the CPO space? What's your view on the investor appetite for transactions and fundraising?
I think it's if I understand well, you mean for the CPOs? So I think these are the CPOs. Again, it depends how you define them. You have asset heavy, asset light. But I think you see, in fact, in the asset light CPOs that are mostly based on software solutions that can host effectively the different users by creating a CPOs. You see quite a strong appetite there. I think it's about having the good ecosystem, having the right business model. But I think in general the market is becoming more selective. But the right sectors within e-mobility as a whole, from a funding point of view and from an investor appetite point of view, remain quite strong.
Is that the experience you've had?
I would say there's definitely an appetite, but there's also a need for them to understand different business models than perhaps what they've seen before. I think Dominique's caveat there about, well, the right business model in the right segment might have a very different response than others, but I would say, yeah, there's definitely appetite. And the thing is, there's a lot of capital needed. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers that the consultants throw out, like the BCGs and the McKinseys, 150 trillion by 2030 just for the commitments made, not what we actually need to do to stay below 1.5 degrees. No, just current commitments. 2 billion raised this year, according to Dominique's chart earlier. Well, there's a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually comes back to the question before that you were talking about, which was the pathway. And can we see that clear pathway? I think some of the challenge is this energy transition is going on in the background, and we are building the pathway as we go and build these businesses. I actually think it's quite a big advantage having EV.Energy based in the UK, because I think the UK is actually thinking through some of these issues in a way that's actually world leading. I think the markets for distribution network services in the UK are the most forward thinking, I think, of anywhere in the world. I think the stuff that National Grid's doing with the demand flexibility service is very forward thinking. We still need more changes, and I think that then makes it somewhat challenging for sometimes investors to get their head around how these changes are going to develop across multiple different international markets and what the returns actually will be. But I think What is undisputed is the transition is happening, and that will create headaches for the grid, and we need to manage that in a way that's coordinated, and that's the role we can play.
So we talked there about pathway, and a couple of you have mentioned the need for different parties to understand or get their head around things and so on. To be clear, who do you think are the major beneficiaries of this kind of transition and this opportunity? Who could they be, and what do they need to know?
The answer is, well, it has to be the end user and society at large. But going a bit deeper into that, the user has to be the beneficiary, period. Because if it doesn't work for the user, how do you convince them from not just buying another diesel truck or van or car or whatever? So that's point one. But what do they need to know to benefit? And I think this is where you'll find varying answers from an audience, is that the OEM will say, oh, don't worry, we'll take care of everything. But the question is, if you can't deliver a truck within 12 months, should you really be focused at getting involved in putting grid meters all across the street? Open question. If you're a utility, are you the most, again, effective at inventing new software models, etc.? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. Are you going to roll that out in other utilities' territory? Yes or no? Or is there a need for different business models, again, where you have slightly different ownership, which is, again, what sort of, again, playing a bit to our own business model, but also if you look at software-only business models, that aggregation of 60 different charger models with hundreds of different vehicle types, with 50 different utilities, or maybe just if you look at the big six in the UK, that's already quite a complex puzzle. And I think people are too much thinking, oh, I'm going to grab everything. I can't work with you because you overlap with my business model in this tiny little sliver, so I'm going to do nothing with you, is the wrong way to think. We really need to move more towards a partnership approach where even companies such as the one sitting here at the panel, we might say, well, we've got a few kilowatts short to participate in this new service WPD has launched. Can we share volume and actually go after this? And it accelerates the uptake of these savings by a few years. These debates aren't happening enough at the moment.
Nodding heads here.
Because we share that common view of delivering for the, I know it's not a flip, I think you have to deliver for the end customer first. And then if you create value, then really it's all about just problem solving, and it's figuring out like how do we collaborate to participate with WPD or National Grid or a utility over here, or a hardware manufacturer that has some interesting integration requirements, or an OEM, and then we piece that all together, and then hopefully we realize the goal that we're all shooting for, which is the impact and the benefit for society of integrating more low carbon tech into the grid.
Just one more question before we go to the room. I'm going to ask Dominique to answer this one. What would your advice be to entrepreneurs, investors focused on grid efficiency? Where are the viable and really monetizable business models?
Yes, I think I will leave this one to some extent to the actual entrepreneurs here who have companies. But just before saying this is that we are very much in the early phases of this. So there's really plenty to do in the areas around trading, for instance, because I think we have been discussing a lot that the automotive industry or the mobility industry and the energy sector, both of them are trillion-dollar industry. This is for the first time through this energy interface, this smart charging, that is truly come together and is only starting. So I think around the trading and the optimization of this, you will see some absolutely plenty of opportunities, and that's really only starting. But Nick, you will probably have a perspective on that as well.
I mean, we've talked about some of these things before on the panel, so I think we would definitely say continue the focus on the driver is got to be the way to think. I think being based in the UK is actually quite good, actually. It's an advantage. It's amazing. The UK is amazing in this front. And then I would say, I think within unlocking these markets, a certain degree of patience is required to know that these things are going to happen over time, but we don't quite know exactly when the regulatory moves will happen, but they do. Just have faith that they will happen.
Yeah, just building on the last one, it is a compounding effect, right? I mean, if you say we've got 700 odd vehicles now, you can do certain things, you can go after certain savings. When you're twice the size, there's other savings you can go after, and you sort of have this continuous improvement thing, I think is really important. In terms of advice to other entrepreneurs, rather than obviously inviting them to be competitors of either of ours, is actually look at one of these challenges we talked about earlier. Like if you can find a way to help the utilities process a grid request for a 7 kilowatt charger or a 150 kilowatt charger in a bus depot in 7 days rather than 60 days, you'll make fortunes, right? Focus on these individual problems, or build a charger that actually can send energy data with any reliability, or a telematics provider that can really pull information within the frequency that you need for grid services, right? 20 times a second. You don't check your petrol tank that often, do you, right? So it's these types of, find one challenge and then really focus and double down on that. That would be my advice.
Interesting stuff, thank you. We talk, don't we, about consumers and drivers and fixing their challenges, and it's exactly the same for anyone looking to get into the space. I'm going to open up now to any questions from within the room. Are there any hands? There's one right at the back, great.
Thank you. I was thinking of changing my strategy and sitting over there, by the way. So well done in spotting me. Hello, panel. The question I have, you mentioned large-scale monetization here. And I think the urban centers have the commercial model to get the charging point infrastructure because of the footfall and the way the commute is and the way the businesses are. The challenge is the rural sector. So how do we create a model from the charge point installation perspective so that we have that equal infrastructure across the regions or bigger regions? Is the economies of scale is the answer if we bring the urban and rural together? Because what I struggle to understand is urban centers have the business case, but is the kind of the rural centers who do not have either the footfall or either the commercial case where the charge point operators will come and say, I'll invest this for you. So how do we tackle that challenge of urban versus rural?
Well, maybe I can start and people can fill in. Data. Because the problem is so we work, for instance, with long-distance coach providers, and they want electric charging infrastructure, but they need to go long distance. So how do you figure out where you can charge without having to plan all the highway infrastructure yourself? It's by sharing information with other people, right? Because there might be trucks doing these routes, or there might be existing bus depots that got infrastructure that isn't used during the day where they can make a pit stop. So I think in the rural areas, it's all about finding that footfall, like you say, through data sharing, and I think councils and utilities have got a big role to play there as sort of central data aggregators or encouragers of information sharing.
I'd agree with data as a massive role to play there. I think in some regards, rural is sometimes easier from a light-duty vehicle perspective because you can oftentimes install home chargers. There are some innovative models where home chargers can be shared amongst communities, which then means that EV adoption can be encouraged. So data has a role to play there, for sure.
Yeah, I think every time we can reduce, in a way, the friction to trading, which is by quicker and better communication is between the different parties is better. Keep in mind, energy by nature is also fairly regional, so you need the users in a certain area to be able to do a certain amount of demand response, but really removing the frictions for this trading to take place and creating the arbitrage and the saving is the key.
Yes.
Hi, Natasha Patel from Baringa. You all have brilliantly touched on some of the key barriers that we're seeing, right? So you talked about the integration of the OEM with the charger, the cost of the charger itself in many instances, and this is talking specifically about, I guess, vehicle to grid, so the actual bi-directional capability that we ideally want to go for eventually. We've talked about standards, and you've talked about communication protocols being an issue. You mentioned the timing of response. Absolutely right, Stephen. The markets need to be there to bid into. You need something convenient for the customer. There are so many things, in a way that need to be fixed. What would you say is the most important thing for us in the room to be focused on in order to really move the dial towards this large-scale monetization?
The most important thing, wow. So I think, well, maybe I'll kick off with an idea around, I think, I've mentioned a couple of times around the UK as being kind of a leading place for this. I think one of the things the UK has done is it's introduced the smart charging regulations that have meant that every single home charger has to be able to respond in real time to signals on the grid. I think that's a really big step in the right direction. And I think there's a role for government and regulators to play to keep up with the technology and keep pushing in the right direction in a supportive way that doesn't stifle innovation, which is hard, but I think that is an example of a good step that was made that has supported regulation and will keep us moving towards that smart and connected future.
I gave some concrete examples earlier that were very specific and perhaps not entirely hypothetical. But I'd second that as well. It's how do you encourage more collaboration or I think more experimentation in what are traditionally perhaps conservative industries because reliability was so important. So how do you get the utilities to experiment with new models? I mean, I think some of what National Grid's done recently on demand flexibility, I mean, they launched that in, what, 4 weeks? That's incredible, right? Did they probably get it first time right? Maybe not, we'll know in a bit. But then they experiment and they refine. And I think encouraging that mindset of the utilities, council, cities, national government, etc., would be helpful.
Yeah, I would say that really in the same direction here. It's about really promote the connectivity of the whole charging point, whether it is at home, where it's being done through regulation, but also destination charging on the way to. And once you have all this truly connected, you can build on that connectivity to achieve the savings. So that's really the key.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, those are all the questions we got time for. Well, no, why not? That was a vigorous hand in the air, so let's just go with one more. I'm sure I'll be in trouble for that.
Thank you. Just a quick question. What do you think the role of smart charging is for public charging and also for vehicle to grid?
I think, yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So I think smart charging is happening inside the home. It's also, I think the ideas, the concept of managing demand in the public space will also become very widespread as well. We already see variable rates on like Tesla superchargers, on like rapid charging networks. The goal there is to increase utilization on those assets. And I think similar kinds of smart charging techniques will be used and deployed to nudge customers to use those assets at times when it's best for the asset operator to increase utilization and then to increase returns and then also allow us all to get access to the charging we need at the times and prices we want.
Yeah, again, violent agreements, I'm afraid. The one thing though is that with the longer charge period you have, obviously the more flexibility you can offer on that given charger. So when you think of public charging, you'd say, well, hold on, they're only plugged in for half an hour. If I double that, people aren't going to be very happy because it goes against the revenue model. But I think what people forget is these energy services often rely on 30-second interruption, 100 millisecond responses. And if you've got enough of them moving with a tolerance or plus or minus 5%, you're not going to notice if it took your car 2 minutes longer to charge than it would have otherwise, right? You're not going to notice that, but you need hundreds or thousands of people plugged in at the same time. So in the end, it's just a data and a communication problem again in the end.
Okay, thank you. So there's obviously huge potential, huge opportunity. The three things I'm kind of taking from this, data, and that was a theme flowing through much of this morning, frameworks and regulation would be other things that I've just picked up particularly here. The last thing from this panel before I let these gentlemen leave is collaboration. So hopefully over your lunch you will have a good opportunity to set in motion some of those projects that this event is famous for. So thank you very much, gentlemen. We've got one more speaker before we let you go to lunch. But first of all, I'd like to thank the panel.